Hello, and welcome to Chatty AF, the anime feminist podcast. My name is Tony. I am a contributing editor here at NFM. You can find me at Poet Pedagogue on Twitter. With me today, again, returning, are MoBlack and the BMC, Black Manga Critic, or Danny. So if you all want to quickly introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hi. I'm MoBlack. I make long form anime content from like a left wing abolitionist, anarchist, whateverist perspective. um, and yeah, I'm just happy to be here. I've admired AnyFem for a long time, so it's great to be working with y'all.
Yeah, and I am BMC, the Black Manga Critic. Not recently, but I have a YouTube channel. I do manga reactions to different kinds of manga. And I have a Twitter where um, I talk about abolition, anti-blackness. Um, yeah, also like you know anarchism, communism, uh, and education, um, and sports. Right. So I talk about a lot of things, but those other things are the main things.
Great. And hopefully, for you all, you know this is a part two of our two-part episode about anime and abolitionist theory and abolitionist practice. So if you have not, go ahead and go back and listen to part one. It's good, I promise. And today we are going to be talking a little bit more in depth about certain like tensions and challenges and more kind of complex ideas in abolitionist theory because now that we've got an introduction, there's a lot of different things that we're all trying to figure out together as abolitionists, and anime provides a really important space to do that. The first one I thought we could start with, because this is a feminist anime podcast. I think a lot of people, when they think about abolition, they often wonder, well, have these abolitionists ever themselves experienced being sexually assaulted or, surviving an act of violence? And I wanted to start with, talking about how the kind of position of survivors as central to abolitionist thought really changes, or solidifies our understanding of abolitionism. And yeah, talk about how that relates to a couple different anime, specifically JoJo's Stone Ocean and Woman Called Fujiko Mine. So, did y'all want to kind of get started with kind of what this means to you, centering survivors in abolitionist work and why that's important?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'll start. I guess to me the basic thing is it's simple, but it's not easy, right? It's simple in the sense that like the main like leadership and organization of any sort of movement should come from the people who are most affected by it, right? But then you get a lot of really pedantic people. It's like, oh, are you saying that someone's right just because they went through this experience, or just because they went through this skin color, or blah blah blah? We can't criticize them, and then you have to go on like a case by case basis and blah blah blah. But like the bottom line is, if you're in a room in your organization or movement or Discord server or whatever, and like all of the people talking are people who have never experienced this before, and they're all talking to each other about how cool they are, you fucked up. That's just, if you can avoid that situation and you instead have a room where it's a bunch of people who actually have skin in the game doing their best to disambiguate this, that's how you know you've like done well.
Yeah, and I would say I think there are definitely like moments where within obviously within popular culture, within our social and political milieu, where when it comes to like thinking like censoring survivors, when you're talking with, let's say, certain people, and kind of like relating to like what Mo said, where you can kind of see that like maybe these people, um, either are just really like uninterested in that centering and are more interested in just kind of like talking about something and kind of showing off, oh well, I know this thing, I know A, B, and C, I know X, Y, Z. Then there are instances, and one that I'm thinking of right now is did any of you and this is just like this is to the audience as a whole too, that have either of you seen that that Jane Fonda clip um when she was on The View, and they were talking about, women's, like, like autonomy, like bodily autonomy, and the state having just this like unacceptable, and that's not to say that there is an acceptable like amount of control that the state should have on women's bodies, right? It's just to say like this is unacceptable, right? Like to have any sort of control over women's bodies. And they were like, well, like, and they were, they were kind of talking with Fonda, and she was, and they're like, well, what do you suggest? And Fonda's like, murder, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember.
Right.
I remember that.
And I think to any one of us who, take centering survivors seriously within our politic, that we were like, yeah, we take Jane Fonda very seriously in that moment, but like there's like this like uncomfortable laughter that occurs, and Jane Fonda's just kind of looking around like, I was dead serious, right? Like she's kind of
Yeah.
like doing it, right? And so it's those are kind of moments where I think are very interesting to where those conversations show up, right? Where we center survivors and we're like, well, you know, okay, so in this instance, we see Jane Fonda suggesting like murder as something like that could maybe lead to resolution of some of that violence. But normally, right, like people are like, whoa, 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 what are you talking about? But at the same time, we have, right, just absurd like levels of state violence, right, death penalties, agents of the state murdering people with impunity, just like, right. So to me, I think when we talk about centering survivors, I think a lot of times what goes sort of unnoticed is the ways in which we view survivors, the request of survivors, right, and the words of survivors and the thoughts of survivors, as opposed as like, just ridiculous, right? But when it comes to like state sanctioned violence and agents of the state enacting state sanctioned violence, right? We again back to what I was talking about with Angela Davis, right? We take that for granted. We're like, yeah, kill them, like, put them, shoot them, like, right? Not we, but you know what I mean, like in terms of the United States or nation states or whatever.
Well, when you think about something like even like what happened with Jordan Neely, right? It's like
Mm.
he's homeless and
Oh yeah.
he's suffering and he's complaining about it. We got to kill him because he's complaining about suffering from being homeless. Like it's like, well, it's, and that's so normalized. Like it's so normalized that you would murder somebody who, is just surviving like homelessness. But it's like, but then, it just shows you kind of the normalization of certain forms of violence when they kind of, I wouldn't say feigned shocked reaction, but certainly like just a little bit disingenuous shocked reaction when we talk about it in any other context. But yeah.
I just like overall we center survivors because in by default we have the tendency to empathize with people who are not survivors, right? And who are not directly impacted by the system. We all by default think the system works super well until something happens to us specifically. That's when we start like questioning, right? So like with the Jordan Neely case, more often than not, the people commenting on it have not been homeless, have not been in that situation, but they have been in a situation where they felt a homeless person made them feel uncomfortable, right? And so the knee jerk reaction is to emphasize with the killer, right? And not with the victim in the situation because you've never been a victim in that case, right? But if you have a default politics, like, okay, we have a system, it abuses people, center to people who are hurt by it first and foremost. You can it's not perfect, but you can at least begin to not have completely unhinged takes where it's like, yeah, if you yell at someone at a subway, execution, that's the which I think if you said that plainly, everyone would realize, yeah, no, that's ridiculous, right? But then when the case shows up, because you're not centering the people who are affected, suddenly like that's literally what you believe, right? And you haven't even skipped a beat.
And it's very interesting because, like, when I'm working with students, and I bring up the Jordan Neely case, and I'm like, oftentimes they will be like, the way they will frame it, because many of them have experienced homelessness, right? Is immediately like, yeah, like, wasn't that dude just like shot for complaining because he was hungry? And I'm
Mm.
like, and I just kind of stand there at the front of the room, and I'm like, I just nod, and I'm like, yeah, keep
Mm-hmm.
going, because because the kids know what's up, if because many of them have, like, the kids I work with anyway, many of,
Mm-hmm.
like, it, not I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but it, they know people in their community who have been through these situations, right? And so it just creates a different kind of empathy, right? um and this becomes really important when we're looking at, and I also want to emphasize that, like, there's many different ways of thinking about survivorship, right? So survivorship we can think about survivorship both in terms of like class, as like we were referring to, like homelessness, but also I think it's important to look at it in terms of gender and sexual violence, because so often, people's derailing critique of abolition is, what about the rapists? And I think that when we look at these situations, and we're gonna, like, the anime in particular, we're gonna look at really gets into this. The prison is actually, in many ways, the site of sexual violence for so many people, right? Prison is not the solution to sexual violence; it causes sexual violence systematically. So the "what about the rapists" kind of line is just incredibly out of touch with the reality of anybody who's actually been in prison, right? So yeah, I'm gonna start by talking about, like, a little bit about a woman called Fujiko Mine. Um, it'll be a little bit of me talking because I'm the only one here who's watched it. But the woman called Fujiko Mine is a really interesting example of this dynamic of the prison system is in itself being the thing that creates sexual violence. And I think about this in particular through the characters of Zenigata and Oscar and the way that they prey on Fujiko. So early in the show, right, Zenigata sleeps with Fujiko and has sex with Fujiko while she's in custody, and frames it partly as kind of like this is the condition of your release is that you sleep with me, which effectively makes it rape, right? There's
Mm.
no way around that, right? It in that
Yes,
we see him kind of, and this, by the way, is something that happens, not necessarily the condition of release, but certainly officers and corrections officers and police raping the incarcerated people and who they take in is rampant. In the prison system. It is extraordinarily common. And so we see in Women Called Fujikamine, like, it actually accurately represented in that sense, right? And there's
Mm.
even a moment where he's about to take a cigarette and put it out on her chest, and she has to flick it away before he does that, because ultimately he's the one who has power in that situation, right? And as he's
right,
doing that, he's also reinforcing, creating this kind of model cop culture for his lieutenant, Oscar, who is a repressed gay person. There's no way around it. Oscar, I'm not sure if Oscar's gay, trans, it's very unclear. Oscar kind of feels like this kind of almost a throwback to the 1920s when we used to talk about inverts, because Oscar is really enjoys dressing up in women's clothing for all of his schemes, wears high heels, and is obviously in love with Senigata. But then
Mm.
Oscar, to demonstrate his power over Fujiko Mine, rapes her. Um, and it is in an extremely upsetting scene, where, and it, in a sense, we're seeing the creation of this kind of cop culture where rape against inmates is normalized, right? Where sexual violence is used for power, right? To demonstrate one's power over the criminal you are taking in, right? it really demonstrates that like cops don't stop violence, they cause it, right? It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't being, and it's really interesting because the show frames Oscar as being like saved by Zenigata, you know, early in his life, he kind of he sees himself as being saved by Zenigata, is what I mean. I don't think that Cho necessarily agrees with that, but then Zenigata's influence on Oscar is actually profoundly negative in terms of
Hmm.
all the ways in which Oscar eventually completely represses his queerness, right? Enacts all of the sexual violence that is shown to be part of the cop culture in the world of the show. And Fujiko then has to live with the trauma from all of that. It's a lot, but I think that the woman called Fujiko Mine really powerfully demonstrates so much of what we're talking about. And Fujiko has to figure out how she's going to survive after all of that trauma. And we're encouraged to kind of go with her through that journey as a survivor. And yeah, it is very anti-cop and
Mm.
very much about the way that cops use sexual violence to enforce that power over people.
From what I've heard, the Lupin series in general is usually pretty good about this stuff. Or
I've not watched enough of it. This is the only Lupin series I've actually ever seen, to be
oh,
honest.
interesting.
Ooh.
But I will say there is something interesting though about I think there's a contrast between Zenigata, how Mario Kata views Zenigata and how Mario Kata views cops and the cultural work that the show is doing. The show is very anti-cop, right? It is very much
Right.
about how cops engage in sexual violence to wield power over people, and that is needs to be abolished, right? But it still wants to honor the history of Zenigata as being like the one good cop that Lupin, respects, or the one cop that Lupin respects, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
it,
Hmm.
it has this kind of really strong tension between, this desire to critique cops, right? And also the legacy of the rest of the show, I guess, where Zenigata is represented as being like kind of the exception to the rule of cops being bastards, where well, Lupin respects that one, but yet the show still has him rape Fujiko and model this horrific thing that Oscar ends up picking up, right?
Right.
Mm. Like I have a hard time thinking of like other anime that are as explicit. Like even just now, I'm like, because a lot of the violence, a lot of the violence that does happen, that is enacted upon survivors, like, is it's like it's not necessarily like within a prison, within like a lot of the anime that we tend to see where that's like a focal point. Um, so it is, and so yeah, so it is interesting that like the personally I don't know because it was like on my end it like the Lupin the Third, like that franchise, like it's not something like I know Fujiko Mine is like an important character within that franchise. I'm not sure like how much like those specific depictions of like you know prison violence are right, like violence of with right, like sexual violence um enacted by like officers, right, agents of the state, like on women. I don't know how much that appears within the series, but I do think that's like a really great instance in terms of like sort of portraying that and like having people like sort of see that within a popular franchise. I think that doesn't I don't think that happens like very often, at least within anime.
Well, what's interesting about Woman Called Fujiko Mine is the way a lot of people look at it is, right, is taking a character who have previously been practically, I mean, like, normally use the term fungible in the context of anti-blackness, but this is a character
Mm,
who's literally interchangeable woman, right? That's, how you would think of Fujiko Mine early in the Lupin series, right? And then
Right.
kind of recontextualizing the whole series through her eyes, right? And through the eyes of somebody who's experienced so much sexualization that is often unwanted, right? And I think that in that way, like the woman called Fujiko Mine really strives to center survivors of sexual violence in a way that I think there's not a humongous amount of other shows that do that. But the other show that I thought could be really interesting to talk about in this context is JoJo's Stone Ocean. I, and yeah, it doesn't have as much depictions of sexual violence in prisons, but I thought it was a really interesting one to talk about kind of the ways that women's agency and women's moral purity is talked about in prison contexts, and like how like sexist ideas of women's purity are used to kind of reinforce like lock 'em away for good, attitudes,
Mm-hmm.
or just disposability attitudes of disposability of the women who are locked up, and also how women resist that, in how how Jolene and allies with the woman around her to fight back. So yeah, what are your thoughts on JoJo Stone Ocean? I guess.
I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of excuse me. I have a lot of thoughts. I think the first place to start, and so I'm gonna preface like my thoughts by saying that I have many friends, Tony included, of course, who were not like fans of the franchise, of the JoJo's franchise, right? And of like the previous parts, adore part 6, right? Like part 6 is like, oh, okay, we're doing something here. Like this is like, wow, like we're really making like a social commentary that is like distinct, and is not vulnerable to bizarre close readings or whatever, right? Or cherry picking or whatever. It's like this like part is like if anything else, like critique of the prison industrial complex and like the violence that is enacted, right, or the violence that women, right, that violence that is enacted upon women like within these particular spaces, like anyone who's like watching part Stone Ocean like and doesn't like take that with them, I'm like, what are we watching? You know what I mean? But I think in the other parts, I think it's very easy to just kind of focus on like, yeah, there's like, magic. There's like a magic system, and what's the word? Familial lineage, and the JoJos and the Joestar family, and like Dio vampires, right? Like it's like, right? It's like okay, but part 6 though, so to me, this like I think part 6 is to me like one of my favorite parts. It's not my favorite part. I think I've said it often, like in the past. Like I've told people, I'm like, part 6 is my favorite part. And I think part 6 only grew to be more, more like cemented as my favorite because of what it does and how my politics have grown and shifted. So, in terms of like one thing that I think is great about Stone Ocean in terms of its depiction of like, sexual violence, right, physical abuse within like prisons is that there are, it's not just right, it's not just okay, the prison guards are the arbiters of violence within prisons, like, and that's where we focus on, like we just focus on like the prison guards. It's like, no, like there's a priest, there's right, there's like Enrico Pucci, who's like supposed to be right this bastion of morality and religious piety, right, like of piety and all these things, but he's like the villain within the prison, right? And normally you have individuals who, right, like the priest is supposed to be a figure that is not even like adjacent to, right, like the prison industrial complex, like in terms of like how people think of like Catholicism, about how people think of like that, but separate, right? Like, he's supposed to be an individual that people who are within that system, who are being uh harmed within that system, are supposed to be able to go to for uh salvation, right? But he is the villain here.
Hmm.
Like, he is like unequivocally like the villain. So I think at the very least, like, that is one authorial choice that I really appreciate by Iraqi with part 6.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree about the priest. That he's actually the reason why I brought up Stone Ocean, because to me, the priest in Stone Ocean represents the ways that the kind of moral purity of women, or moral purity in general, is litigated in prisons to create, all these different ideas about who is deserving of, salvation, meaning like reform, and what that looks like, and how in the position of the prison as a space of reform. He represents the hypocrisy of how of this idea of prisons as a space for moral reform. Because, I mean, at once, obviously, he's a terrible, terrible person, right? So who is he to talk about moral purity and like any of that? But on a much deeper level, right? He has this one moment. One of his episodes where he's introduced, he talks about um, this idea that this idea that of reformability, right? People are in here so that they can reform and become
Mm-hmm.
better people. But then simultaneous to that, and completely contradicting that, he dictates that many of the people he comes across are just like, no, that person is unreformable. They should just be in here forever, right? Or die, right? And so there's this kind of contradiction there that represents, I think, a significant contradiction within the system as itself, and as it pertains to like how we talk about prisons, right? Because we often will justify prisons as saying like, well, people need a space where they can reform. We should be rehabilitating criminals and blah blah blah. But then in the same breath, they'll also say, well, what do you do about the rapists and murderers? We should just lock them away forever. Fuck those people, and
Mm.
there's this deep contradiction, right? Like, what are prisons for? Are they for rehabilitation, or are they for just putting away the people who we think are going to do terrible things and are completely unreformable? But either way, the ideology is we should put these people away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So he represents how, like, no matter what way you look at prisons, it always like within the system, it always results in let's lock people away. There's also an element, right, also of moral reform, right? When we look specifically, there's a history of women's prisons as reformatories, right? I brought up Sadiya Hartman's Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments in a previous episode. Both Sadiya Hartman and Hugh Ryan are the two scholars who I think have really deeply looked into this. So, like, there's a long history of this, and if it's okay, I'm
Mm.
going to do a little bit of a dive into that history, if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, please.
So Hartman early in and this history's also gone into in Our Prison's Obsolete, so this is
Mm.
not, there's a long history of this kind of scholarship. But Hartman really goes into how Black women, at the turn of the century, as they were trying to figure out their subjecthood and how to be autonomous human beings within, the afterlife of slavery, those acts of autonomy were then pathologized as being like morally decrepit and gross and like just indecent and being a whore or whatever. And so they were often like swept up for walking around, simply for walking around, and locked up in these reformatories where, they would be taught to be domestic servants and, yada, yada, yada. And it would be impossible. It would be basically impossible for them to actually meet the level of morality, um, the kind of morality that these prisons were trying to instill upon them without completely destroying their self, right? It was essentially trying to push them back into a state of enslavement, unambiguously. And so the minute they tried to have ideas, be a human being, no, that's you being a disgusting person. You need to be locked up for longer, to continue to be reformed, right? And
Yeah.
I think that the priest in JoJo Stone Ocean really represents that. And that history kind of is continued through, the 20th century with the Women's House of Detention in Manhattan, which was a place where all sorts of women who were gender nonconforming, largely black, largely queer women, were locked
Mm-hmm.
up. In fact, Tupac's mom was locked up in the Women's House of D. Tupac's mom,
Mm-hmm.
who was a bisexual woman, by the way, from the prison window, she witnessed the Stonewall Rebellion as it was happening, right?
Mhm.
And she decided based on that to try to build coalitions between the Black Panthers and the Gay Liberation Front, right? As that was happening, right, like the House of D was just taking any woman off the street that it could find that was not gender conforming, stone butches. It would take trans men, obviously trans men are not women, but people who are assigned female at birth, people who the state viewed as women, right,
Right, right.
and locking them up and trying to reform them morally. I mean, this is a very personal history to me, I think, because I actually got to, once see Jay Toole, who was one of the people at Stonewall, one of these stone butches who was taken into the Women's House of D, speak. And she's talked about how every single time in the Women's House of D, when a woman will be picked up for this moral decrepitude, this alleged moral decrepitude, right? She would be raped every single
Mm.
time. And so the system produces the moral decrepitude, right? That it is then criminalizing.
It's almost as if, I guess, like, if it happens in a prison to the right people, then it's, I guess, the system working as designed, and people don't see a problem with it. They don't realize that, like, this is just a reproduction of the very thing that you claim to want to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like the really upsetting thing is like when we talk about, right, like rape, prisons are where a lot of rape happens. So
Yeah.
it's like, why are we talking about prison as being a solution to rape when prison is where people will be raped?
Yeah. I think that's where. Yeah. I think it's where the. I think it's like sort of two parts. Like on one part, this sort of disconnect that happens, right? That on one side of it is, there, maybe there are people, and I say some like children, right, who generally are not um aware of certain things, and I say like I'm thinking like really young children, right, like who just are not aware of certain things just because of where their age are. And that's not to say that all children aren't aware, because there, of course, there are children that are aware of this like violence that happens because they are, right, the children um of those survivors. So I think there's like one part of that where people just like don't know, and that's just because of certain circumstances, like maybe age, like they're just very young and they don't. And then there's the other side of it where it's just like a very like willful, which I think is the larger like side of that, right, or the larger half of that, which is like or the larger part, which is that there are people are aware, right? People know that this is
Mm.
a space where rape, right? Like the prison is a space where like rape occurs, um, um, sexual violence generally occurs, and we know this because, right, even when, right, even as like as educators, you hear the jokes, right, like right, you hear the comments, you hear the kids
Yes.
like making comments
Yes.
like referring to that to prison violence, to sexual assault,
Like,
to
don't
rape.
drop the soap, that sort of crap.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not to say that like there aren't, right. It's not to say that all children are unaware. Like many children are aware, right? And that's because um that violence has become so ingrained into not only the prison industrial complex is something that keeps it um that strengthens it, right? In this like really perverse way, but is also a part of our like social consciousness, right? In terms of like what we know and what's acceptable to like joke about, what's acceptable to mention in these like awful sort of ways.
Yeah, and I think that to bring it back to JoJo Stone Ocean, what I really
Hmm.
love about the show is it's about these women who have been who society has deemed like irredeemable, right? Trying to fight back against the people who are, categorizing them. People like that priest who are categorizing them as irredeemable, or alternatively, perhaps even worse, in need of reform, right? And trying to act in solidarity with each other within these situations, right? I mean, even in one of the first few episodes, like um Jolene, like as she hears Hermes be like brutally
Yes.
beaten up by these guards, right?
Yep.
She One of her first uses of her powers is to protect one of her like fellow inmates,
Mm-hmm.
from that violence. And it's interesting because the show kind of has this like all JoJo shows, every character kind of starts off like most of the fun sidekick characters kind of start off as complete, sociopaths
Yep.
before they become like, your best friend.
Right, yeah, yeah, that's like very that I think, yeah, that like that's like a staple of JoJo's, where like there's like a character who is like initially introduced and they're like, you know, an antagonist, right? Like to
Hmm.
whichever JoJo is the protagonist, and then ultimately, after a certain number of episodes or some instance where they have to work together, then they become like really close and they're like, you know like a confidant, like, and like really close friends and things like that. Yeah. Yep.
And I think that just reads very differently in a show that takes place in a prison among women who are trying to survive.
Oh
It
yeah.
feels it has a very different valence there, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think it's like kind of back to what I was saying earlier, where that when you're watching the earlier parts of JoJo, it's very sort of easy to just kind of, okay, like this is a trope. Like this is something that happens within JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, right? There are other characters who ride like a speedwagon, like in part one, a Caesar in part two, a Polnareff in part three, or right, like and people who've watched JoJo's like know these characters that I'm like sort of rattling off. But right, like these are characters that are very much so a part of an overall trope, and Hermes is very distinctly different and is connected to that trope in a very like sort of generic sense, but really so very, but like this character, like this, right, like Hermes really becomes like a, a super like a much more important, a much more vital um instance of, right, sexual assault, state PIC sanctioned violence, these kinds of, right, these important topics that are discussed. So I think part six is like even just Hermes is like a really significant departure from what the JoJo fandom and individuals who generally just kind of maybe like generally watch JoJo's are used to.
they're much more used to characters like Gwess, right? Gwess or Guess.
Hmm.
eh,
Either
or
or.
like or Foo Fighters, right? Who are
Yep.
characters that's much more of kind of like what I was talking about with like the kind of starting off as absolutely crazy people. But the thing is that it feels like they're starting off as like people who are incredibly violent because the system is violent and that they are trying to gain some agency within a system that is incredibly violent, right? And it is
Yes.
contextualized within the culture of the space. It doesn't feel like they're just being violent for no reason, like Zipper Boy in part five. They are violent because the system is violent, right?
I'm still thinking of Zipper Boy. Like, I'm gonna like.
Zipper
I think for the
Boy.
like that's um no, but yeah, like no, definitely. And I feel like one thing I'm also thinking about with Stone Ocean is, you know again, the ways in which, right, like systems, right, and in particular the prison is like there is no one within these systems, and in particular the prison, that is unaffected in some
Mhm.
way. And this is why, like, I think part six works really well, because you have these different antagonists, and it's not just, right, like, again, it's like it's not just uh the individuals who are supposed to be these like agents of the state in terms of like officers, correctional officers, right? But it's also like the prison doctor, the janitor, right? These figures who are within this space, who are supposed, right? Who, normally you're not like, oh my god, like the janitor, or right, the doctor, but like, right, but it's like Thunder McQueen is like an inmate who is working as a janitor and is like obsessed, right? Is like obsessed with Hermes, and like has consistently like assaulted Hermes through through his stand, right, ability, amongst other
Mm.
things. So it's kind of one of those things where, right, it's like there is no person within that space who is unaffected. We can also think about Emporio, right? Who I think is like
Mm.
another like figure that is very distinct, right? Is like a very distinct commentary on like the violence that is enacted within prison, right? Emporio is, as folks know who watch part 6, Emporio is a child who has been who was born within the prison, right?
Which is, of course, silly JoJo's nonsense, but still.
Yeah, yeah. Right. I mean, his whole character is like very bizarre, but I think at the same time there is like, at
He
least
also
there's like
looks like an old
you know what I
man.
mean? Yeah.
He looks like an old man. Let's be real here. He looks like he's 50. He's got the JoJo's ugly face going on.
Yes.
Kind of
Yes.
sounds like classic
Uh,
JoJo shenanigans.
Right. But even within, right, but even then, like, it's like the joke, like there's no way that like even like with the JoJo shenanigans are like exempt from like the effects of like the prison, right? Like you can't just have this character who like looks 50 and he's just kind of there to be there. It's like, no, it's also like related to like state violence, prison violence, right? So I'm gonna move on from him, but I do think that like, yeah, like part 6 is very much so sort of like really great in showcasing that like if you are right, if you were within that system, like there is not a single person within that system that can escape the effects of that violence.
all right. Shall we move on to the next piece? I think we should move on to talking about like the state, the question of the state, because the state is a question. It's funny. Whenever you talk about something as a question, you know that we're talking about destroying it, right? Like, and I mean that both in the
Historically, that's
context of fascism and in the context of abolitionism. But yeah, so I think that there's multiple strands in abolitionist thoughts. So, as I talked about in the first episode, some of it is more statist abolitionist thought that believes that somehow we can create a socialist state that still has abolished the police and prisons. Again, I really am not. I personally am not sure how, but I I think anarcho-communism kind of points away to that. Whereas there's other strands that are fully anarchist. And I thought that maybe it would be cool to talk about the anime Decadence in the context of that, because Decadence's ending gives us an idea of like what happens when revolution doesn't actually, mean the the complete overhaul or destruction of an entire system. It's more repurposing.
So Decadence, just the TLDR, that's post-apocalyptic future, climate change, pollution, blah blah blah, um, corporations, blah blah blah. And there's basically two classes of people. They're human beings who are called tankers, who live in poverty. They live on this giant ship called the Decadence, uh, and they fight monsters called Godals. And there's this cyborg race called the Gears, who basically treat all of humanity like a video game. They log into an avatar and they fight the monsters for fun and for glory. Um, and it's essentially about a human Natsume and her gear boss, Kaburagi, uh, pretty much realizing that the system is exploitative and it kills people and it should die. Um, and there's a lot of good stuff. There's a prison riot at one point, which is really fun. There's a lot of really choice lines. Oh, I don't have my Decadence quotes with me, but there's a lot of really good lines about like how can you let the system control you and blah blah blah. It's really great. Um,
A lot of the system, man.
yeah.
Energy.
The question then, so towards the ending, um, the way it ends is there is like a radical transformation in how things work. Um, Rather than this like parasitic relationship between human and gears, they kind of like live in harmony. There's you can farm now. The video game is Stardew Valley instead of COD or whatever. um, there's like more. There's like more sustainability. There's not like as much coercion. Um, but the system, which is a literal thing, like the computer system that like runs everything, is still in place, and it's run by an administrator of the old system who has basically like changed his mind, right? Um, and so the question, there's basically two things about decadence. The first is the second half of the show really focuses on the gears a lot more than the tankers, and it goes back to like centering the people who are most affected, right? Um, there's definitely like a desire when you watch it to see more of like the humans in the back half of the show, and not so much the gears. Although the gears are very fun and cute and they have like great designs. And the other thing is like is that enough, right? You have overhauled the system, but like there is still a system, and it is still run by like kind of the old guard. So there's a question of like, is that thorough enough, right? And also, who decided that? Like, why? Like the show, it thinks very far ahead, but then seemingly not far ahead enough to imagine like maybe a more like democratic organization of like the system, or a system where there's like more input, or a system where like the humans actually run it, right? So there's a lot of interesting questions that I think map onto like the questions of abolitionist movements as well. To be clear, I think the show is so fucking good. I love it so much. Like I highly like 10 out of 10 watch. It's good enough that even with this ending, which I think falls a little short, it's still like an emotionally satisfying ending for basically every character. Like it makes sense why they did it.
Yeah, I was rewatching the ending earlier today, and I don't know. Every time Natsume was on screen, I started crying, and I'm like, why am I
She's such a
crying?
good protagonist.
Oh, it's great.
She's
Fantastic.
like
I wish he had stayed the protagonist, though. You know what I mean?
that goes back to to what we were talking about, right?
Mm,
Yeah. It's so funny. The show creates such a fantastic protagonist in Natsume, and you think she's going to be protagonist in the first episode. And then, very slowly over the course of the show, she becomes less and less and less of a protagonist. And, like, I think part of what frustrates me about Decadence, right, is that I think that um, she is kept in the dark over so much of what she's doing. Even in the process, like there's an episode where they're like destroying the God All factory, the monster factory, right? She
mhm.
doesn't know what she's doing when she's doing that. She's just like, I'm just coming along with you doing this thing. I don't know what it is, but I guess I'm doing it, right? But she doesn't even know that she's about to destroy the entire like system that like governs her life, and she's just doing it. And it's a little bit like it reminds me a lot of like what Paulo Freire talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is like you
Mm,
need to like you cannot be assuming that you have more knowledge than the people who you are working with and trying to liberate. That is,
Right.
yeah.
and certainly you cannot be hiding information from them or manipulating them for 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 your revolutionary purpose.
I think if we think a little, uh, it's funny. If we think a little less politically and a little bit more like just like the dynamics of the anime, if I had to think about it, I think there's like some sort of anxiety, maybe from the staff. I don't know who it is, maybe from the studio, whatever. There's not actually a belief that like in this story with like all these gears and stuff like that, that like an ordinary female disabled human can actually like carry the show. I think that's an unfortunate thing that they maybe thought. And so they tried probably to get more Kaburagi there out of I guess some sort of assumption that like he would be like a better lead or a more compelling lead. But Kabaragi's great, but he's not a more compelling lead than Natsume. He just like flat out isn't. Natsume is just like the best person for the role in her own show, right? She's optimistic. She's like human. She's real, right? She's got all these amazing faces. Her expressions are so awesome, um, and yet there's like, I guess, like in real world, there's like a lack of trust that like the most suppressed can like lead social change, right? There's
Yeah.
also a lack of trust that Natsume can like lead her own show, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one thing I think that it's weird because I feel like the majority, I feel like a lot of people, it's like, and it's not that Kaburagi is a a bad, right, quote unquote bad character or anything like that. It's just
Oh,
like,
he's
yeah, like
great.
he's, like
He
he's
just
great. Like
shouldn't be like the lead.
yeah, you know, and I feel like it is an unfortunate thing because there are just so many great things going for the show and like kind of like the messages that it's trying to portray and how Natsume um does that. And I think there's an instance, right? Like there's an instance where the show is doing like a really great job, and there's a way in which like Natsume, right, becomes more confident. Like like it's very like, right, unwavering in kind in terms of like what her sort of goals are and what she intends to do. Um but and there's that growth in that, but then like there's a point where it's just like, okay, let's kind of shelve that, and let's talk about like Kaburagi, the cyborg, and like, what his issues are and like what he's been going through, and like, and it's like, okay, but I think all of us here are like, we're just more invested in Natsume and like her growth as like, in a lot of ways, like a revolutionary, right? And
Yes.
yeah. So it's an unfortunate thing. It's an unfortunate thing because I think, as I like, yeah, and especially like towards the tail end, you're like, it's almost like the show tries to at some point kind of like reinsert that narrative and tries to make it like, yeah, like we didn't forget, but it's like, like, but Kaburagi is still like, he's still like very much so like at the center. Everything like revolves around what he's able to do and his skill set, right, and his drive. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, just
Yeah, and like
I think
bring
it's a shame.
sorry.
Just quickly, like the fact that like Kaburagi is the one that takes down the system with like, I mean, the humans help a little bit, but it's like insignificant. I think that's just like kind of wasted potential,
Mm.
honestly. Like as much I love the show so much, I'm not sure my brain would be able to handle it if it was the same, but also the ending was better. Then I think I would never watch any other anime again. I think I just like watch Deca-Dence on repeat.
It's also interesting because I think of Decadence, right, like as like an attempt to kind of return to some of the same themes. So like right before this, you all we had the Death Parade podcast come out. You're probably listening to this after the Death Parade podcast that we put out, where I talked a lot about how the director of Decadence in Death Parade kind of confronts the system and like, proposes these kind of interpersonal transformations as like, the character's responses to a wildly unjust system rather than taking down the system as a whole. And I think Decadence was him attempting to return to those themes and say, like, well, actually, no, actually, I'm a revolutionary. Things need to be taken. Things actually need to change, and the system itself needs to be taken down.
Mhm.
But the question is, ultimately, was the imagination of the writer and director enough to like create a truly revolutionary show, or is it just kind of creating a system that is effectively, less oppressive, but still kind of generating capital through,
Mm.
another kind of relation. I'm still unclear about whether there's another kind of planet where everybody else is, and this is just kind of like a vacation spot for everyone to go and have some fun at. I feel a little bit unclear about the world building, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. I do think. Yeah, I agree. I would agree with that.
So I guess the last thing I'd say about Decadence is just I would encourage people to watch it. I promise you'll have a good time, and like watch it with those questions in mind about like what is it that you imagine when you truly say like the characters say that you want to like overturn the entire system, and then compare it with what the show actually does, and then see for yourself if you are satisfied or not. Because I think doing that will also get you thinking about the exact same questions through like abolition and abolitionist movements.
All right. Unfortunately, Mo has to step off now, but we're going to continue the podcast. Uh, we're going to keep going, but unfortunately, he has to step off. So, um, remind us where we can find you, Mo.
Oh yes, MoBlack.xyz. It's been super fun. Thank you so much for having me. I've read the rest of this conversation. I can see the future. I know it'll be great. So please don't leave. All right, take care.
Take care. So good having you. So, Danny, I
Mm.
I I wanted to bring in one of both of our favorite theorists
Ah.
to talk about, to talk about like a little bit about decadence and also bring us into our next conversation. What do you think about Joy James and her theories of kind of revolutionary transformation?
Me, I mean, yeah, I love her work. I love many of the ways in which she challenges, like, and is really just like a kind of like a true kind of scholar in that sense, like, sort of surveys the landscapes of um criticism, uh black studies criticisms, um and it's just sort of like, hmm, something or some things are not being like uh examined enough, or people aren't being honest enough about the state of certain struggles and the decisions that are made, um, both in academic spaces and within organizing spaces, and just amongst ourselves in terms of like how we talk about, how we talk about revolution, how we talk about abolition, how we talk about black feminism. So yeah, I think she's great. I think she's great. And I think she's just like constantly like on the forefront of like being like, all right, y'all gotta be honest about, X, Y, and Z. And if we can't be honest about those things, then the scholarship is not um then the scholarship won't be particularly useful for what we're trying to do as abolitionists.
Yeah, and I think that specifically referring to a piece that she put out. So Joy James herself, her focus, for those of y'all who don't know, which is probably a lot of people, Joy James is a scholar of incarcerated intellectuals. So she works with intellectuals who have been put in prison because often that's for political reasons, right? And tries to elevate their voices, make sure and bring their conversations into the scholarly tradition through her work. But she also is a scholar of abolitionism and Black studies. And one of her like her pieces that really caused a buzz a couple years ago, I believe, 3 years ago, right during the center of the George Floyd protests, was a piece called Airbrushing Revolution for the Sake of Abolition. In this
Mm-hmm.
piece, she was responding to, as I was talking about earlier, this kind of breaking of abolitionism into the mainstream and kind of this kind of almost comforting narrative of abolition that like it can be achieved through, these ways where there does not necessarily have to be I don't want to say violent revolution, but like where there doesn't have to be the kind of like rigorous militant
Mm-hmm.
trans transformation and like struggle.
Yep.
and kind of critiquing the placement of abolitionist theory within the academy as such, as being like kind of this woo-woo theory that's not really necessarily connected to the violence of people's lives and to the
Mm.
like re- the reality of kind of trying to prison break and get people, out of the situation of incarceration and the actual lived experience of that. And I think that that's really interesting because her work, I think, clarifies a little bit of this kind of, decadence and I think at large a lot of anime's like way of looking at revolution, right?
Yeah.
As this kind of impulse, this affective, theoretical impulse towards taking down the system, take it down. It can be done through ideas, through the idea of, you just got to convince the people that this is what's right. Um, and, I think that or alternatively, like we can slowly, I think this is also partly a critique, I think, of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whose work is
Mm.
sometimes like talks about like, the gradual like repurposing of the state that we have in using it to create, new systems and like gradually those new systems completely replacing the old, right? And I think that there's a critique there of that kind of like, can the system be repurposed and still change everything in the way that abolitionism says it can, in the way that even Ruth Wilson Gilmore's, of course, I say even Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in the way that Ruth Wilson Gilmore says is necessary, right?
Yeah.
Ruth Wilson Gilmore herself being, of course, one of the most important scholars of abolitionist ideas. She wrote
Mm-hmm.
Golden Gulag,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Decadence is like this interesting text because it kind of reveals the limits of that kind of understanding of revolution, right?
I think they're like one thing I do like about Decadence before sort of like the ending, and I think all of us are kind of like in agreement that like the ending is very kind of woo woo and kind of all over the place and doesn't really have, and at least to me is not very specific or or cemented in terms of like, okay, what will like the world, not like it's necessarily but what the world will look like, but just like what will actually change, what truly different systems, and not only system but like what will be put in place that like is like inherently different from what we had before, right? Like you still have like, you know, these sports, you still have like these systems where people are like, paying for different kinds of foods and things like that. And it's almost like a hodgepodge of like ideas at the end where it's like, yeah, cultivating our own food and like controlling the means of production, but also like, you know, um, here are these stalls where you're going to buy these things for these particular prices. And there's like some market system apparently that came from somewhere. So it's like stuff like that where I think the ending is kind of like bizarre in that way. It's not particularly, to me, useful um in terms of like sort of imagining what like revolution would look like in that sense. But I do think there are other instances in terms of like a path towards like revolution in which decadence is useful, and is like uh very much so kind of like related to some of the work that Joy James has done in terms of like talking about, you know, airbrushing abolition and thinking about the people who are working towards abolition. So there's that.
Yeah, I think that it's like it. That's one of the big struggles for me, like especially as like a disabled person, right? Like
Mm,
I what if the revolution creates a space where disabled people are thrown away, right? Where the organized abandonment is worse, because there's
yeah.
nothing to to actually create any kind of stability for disabled people, right? Like If
Mm-hmm.
I can't get my meds after the
Yeah.
revolution, I am, what is the purpose? What are we doing here? And so that like is part of the question, right? Like of anarchism versus like, a more communist system. Like when I was used to organize with Miriam Kaba, she would often say like the reason I'm a communist and not an anarchist is because I fully believe that the state's power is too important for us to just throw away, right? The state can have this incredibly important, role in protecting people and preventing organized abandonment of people. That's why
Mm,
communism is a thing, right?
yeah.
But and I think that's why I kind of align myself more with like an anarcho-communist mindset rather than
Hmm.
I'm not a full anarchist, right? I'm like it's just the idea of abdicating state power entirely is a question, right? In abolitionism, can a state
Mm,
exist without the police? I
mm.
like, can it? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I think and I think this is where Joy James is really great for her interventions, and I would say that George James is sort of like is probably of the opinion that and that the answer to that question is like the state is um inherently like violent, right? The state
Mm,
and the state will use that violence, right, to stabilize itself
yes,
in multiple ways, right? But I think both of us are probably thinking of like that idea of like of James's idea of the captive maternal, and I think
yes, which I
that
was
right,
you're gonna use yes in just a
yeah,
second to transition us.
yeah. So, and I think that like decadence is great, not necessarily towards the end, but I think um not the ending, but I think like prior to that, I think there are figures like within decadence who are specifically right like harmed, right, but also take on those roles of okay, like right caretakers, individuals who um will do that revolutionary work and
Mhm,
um who are as like um James would say like um it like take on those roles that are as James would say completely worthy of them, but um those
mhm.
roles, right, those functions, right, their functions, right, stabilize the system, right, at least within decadence. So it's an interesting thing.
And
Yeah.
Decadence explicitly says that actually at one point,
Yeah.
like when Kabaragi's in this big confrontation with the big boss, he says like, what's going on here? Why are you even talking to me? I'm a bug. And she says, well, you know, bugs actually the create the continued maintenance of and destruction of bugs actually is what stabilizes the system. It's not without they're the bugs in a sense, uh, they're recuperated back into the system, which brings us, I guess, to talking about the captive maternal, which brings us to dismantling anti-blackness, right? So Joy James
Yeah.
has this concept called the captive maternal, and I'm going to use it as a way to kind of bring us into Michiko and Hatchin, because and this is how we're going to end the episode, because I don't know if we're going to have a lot to talk about with Michiko and Hatchin, because both of us are still in the process of watching it, but
Mm.
it brings up a lot to think about with the captive maternal. So to kind of introduce that idea, the captive maternal is a theory of Joy James of understanding how women of color's reproductive labor and maternal labor and feminized labor is used to reinforce and reinforce the system that ultimately oppresses them. Like the classic example that she gives, right, is she talks about in the podcast she has with on millennials are killing capitalism, like the mother whose child is currently whose child is in trying to go to school, right, and so
Mm-hmm.
the mother does everything that she can to like she's a black mother, right, she sees that the school is like hyper segregated, the local school is hyper segregated, and so she might join the PTA, or she might protest, or she might try to do everything that she can to try to make the school livable for her child. Um, but ultimately, all that labor to try to make the school even moderately, possible to survive for her child is
Yeah.
reincorporated back into it and to stabilize the system itself of the school, and simultaneously you know, her child can possibly see, that the system is not going to prepare the child for, the above ground economies, the markets. And so they enter the underground economy where, as James puts it, the blood is, you know, on the ground rather than on the stock
Yep.
floor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's but the point is the process of resistance and trying to create livable lives reinforces the violence of the system, especially as it pertains to, for example, like the wives of people who are incarcerated who try to,
Yeah.
make that system livable for their husbands, etc. Right? So I wanted to bring this up. Did you have anything you wanted to add about like kind of that theory before we move into like
No, that's
talking about Michiko
pretty.
and Hatchin?
Yeah, I think it's great. What I would also say, yeah, to add to one more thing is that I think one thing with this idea, well, the function of the captain paternal is like it's like yeah, a couple things. One is that um James kind of states this pretty explicitly multiple times, but it's like the captain maternal is like a function, so it's not just, oh, like here's this person over here, or this person is you know um a captive maternal. It's more like the relationship between this individual and the state and these systems, right? And the individual's relationship between the people, their loved ones, right? And the people that they are working to protect and care for. Like that,
Yes.
right, that creates something very distinct, right? So it's so when we're kind of thinking about that, we have to kind of keep that at the forefront. I think the second thing is that this is also something that's like I think pretty explicit, and just like one within abolition, and two within like sort of James and when sort of the her scholarship is that captain maternals are not like these like sort of angelic maternal figures, right? Like not every captain maternal
Not at all. No.
is this like you know perfect like mother figure or something like that, right? Who was like harmed by the state, but that like captain maternals, right, in their function, right, are flawed, and those and right are flawed people, and those flaws um uh are also like included in terms of how the function of the captain maternal stabilizes the state and stabilizes uh these systems. Yeah.
Right. There's a certain like element of like we often talk about quote unquote intergenerational trauma. And it's often done in this
Yes.
very kind of it's often done in this very depoliticized way where it's just like we need to break the cycles of trauma, blah 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 blah. In a way that often pathologizes our parents and the people who like
Hmm.
went through things that are unimaginable to us, right?
Hmm.
I see this so much in Asian American communities, but if we look at it in the context of the captive maternal, right, like we understand that the kind of the extreme sacrifice and labor that these women of color go through to support their children is what stabilizes the system, right, and is what makes their children's lives, not completely collapse from under them. And of course is what fucks them up, right? It's a captive position, and it's also not fungible in the sense that it is not. Captive maternals often occupy very different positions within these power structures. She talks about Asada Shakur as a captive maternal, but I wanted to go
Mm.
in. But she also talks about because Asada, for all of her work to resist the state, she also the Black Panther's free breakfast program that made
Hmm.
it was an example of how that is stuff that the government should have been doing. They should have
Doing.
been providing
Yeah.
those breakfasts. But instead the Black Panther Party stabilizes the survival of its people while also reinforcing the state's ability to continue this position of organized abandonment, because it's about organized abandonment. It's about the state and our entire society completely abandoning an entire class of people
Yes.
because of where they live and who they are. And we see this so much in Michiko and Hatchin. Oh, we're going to get to it. So, Michiko and Hatchin is about all the people who've experienced the worst of organized abandonment, who have
Mm-hmm.
been systematically shut out of just even a basic survival, with, and who have to, as James talks about, enter underground economies, to survive because of all of this, of that profound organized abandonment. And I wanted to talk a little bit about like Michiko and Atsuko as two different captive maternals, and also Pepe, because Pepe is a really interesting example of a captive maternal. So I think all three of them are really interesting examples of captive maternals. Like these women of
Yep.
color, especially, Afro Latina women who are just kind of trapped in this system that is, well, trapped in a position of having to pick up the pieces for what the state abandons,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of, whether they feel qualified to or are really have the ability to or not.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Did you want to kind of speak to that?
I guess I feel like I could start any of them, but I think where I definitely want to start is I guess it would make the most sense to start with Michiko, because most people who have like
Yes.
watched the show will probably, see her most often and kind of like be able to like see the links between her situation within the show and Joy James's work in terms of thinking about like the captive
Yes.
maternal. Um,
Yeah.
but also like Atsuko, right? Like is like her is very
Mm,
interesting because because there is for that. But I guess I'll start with Michiko. So for me, the thing that I think is, and the word I'd probably use is like heartbreaking, is that with Michiko, right? Like the premise kind of like of the show, like as we're sort of going along, is Michiko's role as a caregiver.
and I suppose before you go on, maybe I should give them a quick summary. So Michiko and Hachin is about two like a 10-year-old girl and a 27-year-old woman. The girl is like white passing, and the 27
Mm-hmm.
year old woman is like Afro Latina, and the girl is, they both are connected because the father of the girl and the boyfriend of uh the father of Hana, or Hachin, and the boyfriend of Michiko, um is the same. It's Hiroshi, and he has gone missing, leading Hana to kind of put in foster care with an abusive family who she has to escape, and then and Michiko to try to find him. And so Michiko tries to kind of just, so Michiko saves Hana from her abusive foster family, right? And
Yep.
yeah, and the show is about them trying to find Hana's father and Michiko's boyfriend, while
Mhm.
escaping the police, because Michiko is a fugitive of the state. Anyways,
Yep.
continue with what you're saying, Danny.
Yeah. No, yeah. And that's important, right? That Michiko is like uh specifically a fugitive, right? A fugitive like of the state. And it's so what I was thinking about was that even as Michiko has this violence that's like um been enacted on her and continues to be enacted on her as a fugitive, right? As a fugitive of the state, as a um uh person who is a right, as an incarcerated person who has escaped prison. Like, so that's one, right? So those are that's something that she is consistently dealing with throughout the show. Um right? And even then she still has the right, even with that, right, she still has like the emotional and physical capacity, right, and mental capacity to work to take care of Hachin and to like find her, right, and to take care of her and to do that caregiving work, right? But right? At the same time, we know that, right? Again, like it is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be the job of the state to like make sure that Hatchin is safe. It is the job of this. It's supposed, right? Amongst right. It like to make sure that she has shelter, to make sure that she has food, like thing, right? Without all of these like really just like abhorrent caveats like the abusive family, right? The padre and that family that's just like absolutely horrible to Hatchin. So I think Michiko is a great character because and relates so much to James's work because again, it's like James will consistently kind of come back to this idea, right? That like it's like one of these people are right that Captain Maternals are flawed, right? They're not right. Michiko is not this like, cookie cutter person who is you know like that we just can't, that we don't have any that's like, super clean or anything like that, right? She's like I think to me distinctly flawed in the show, like for that reason. um and yet, right, her her role, like, right, as a caregiver, as someone who is trying to like take care of Hatchin, is like, again, like in the words of Footer James, is like it's completely like it's like a task, right, that is like completely worthy of Michiko, right? This right, in her ability to like love, in her ability to care for other
Mm-hmm.
people, to and to continue to do that even while she is a fugitive of the state, right? And yeah. So that's one thing that I would say. I would say that about Michiko.
Yeah, and to add on to that, right? Like she resists that role. It's not like she takes that role and is like fully ready to accept
Mm-hmm.
it. And there's times and that's the thing about the Captain Maternal. It's not a choice. It's something that is
No.
done under threat of violence, right? So
Yep.
she tries to drop like Hachin off at a orphanage, right? The same orphanage where she grew up, by the way. That she knew that
Mm-hmm.
orphans were being sold into child trafficking, right? And of course, the matron of the orphanage just throws Hachin away and is like, "No, you don't have any money. Go away." Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Michiko is forced back into that role of the captive maternal, even as she's like rejecting it. And by the way, her rejecting it is not inherently a good thing. The captive
Mm-hmm.
maternal is not a. It's not necessary as Danny was saying, and as George James says, it is these are roles and work that are worthy of her. These are good. These are often like deeply meaningful like things, right? Providing free breakfasts, as the Black Panthers did,
Yeah.
right? But it is done under this threat of violence and in a way that can only stabilize the state, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting and the thing about the Captain Maternals, right, is that it is also not. She also emphasized it's not fungible. There's also people who are doing things that where they are agents of the state as Captain Maternals. People
Mm.
like Atsuko, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's so many there's just like so many like intricacies in terms of her function as a Captain Maternal, the relationship between her and Michiko, the colorism um that
Oh
occurs
yes.
between the two, right? And and again, and right, and like all of these things um only serve to stabilize a state, right? If we consider
Hmm.
right, if we go back to some, right, and we consider like, right, Michiko and her caregiving, right, when it comes to Hatchin, like that is like, right, the state will be like, okay, right, that is one less child that I have to uh be concerned with, because I know that even as, right, that right in the state, right, I'm kind of like personifying the state, but right, the state is sort of like, yeah, like I know that Michiko is working as a caregiver for for Hatchin, for this child. So there are this number these number of things, right? These fewer number of things like that I have to provide, that I have to do. And when we think about the relationship between Michiko and Atsuko, like I think the one thing for me is like like the relationship is also key, but I also think that the fact that Atsuko is an agent of the state is one of those things that I think sometimes people, right, like again, like Captain Maternals are flawed, right, and it's an important distinction, because not all captive maternals are actively working um, against the state,
No.
and simultaneously stabilizing the state, right? Like this is a character, right? Atsuko is a character who is an agent of the state, right? And
Hmm.
has been harmed by the state, right? But it's still doing that,
Yep.
and is like in maybe even, and not necessarily in more like stabilizing the state more in a sense, but is definitely doing it in a like actively in a conscious way, right? Is like consciously
Hmm.
stabilizing the state as a agent of the state, right? So yeah.
And even as she's doing it, of course, put in this position where she has to choose between, like, am I going to continue to enact this violence against my former friend, right, Michiko, or am I going to resist the states, resist? And when she lets Michiko go, well, first of all, she was going to get, thrown away anyways. Hazuko was going to get thrown away anyways. Like, as Savannah Shange puts it, like the state eats it, the police force eats its own sometimes, and it protects its own. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna like delete all of what I just said. Okay, I'm thinking, how do I put this? I'm running out of steam. We should wrap this up. The point is, Atsuko is put in this position, right, where she has to choose whether she's going to continue this role of hunting down the people who she cares about, right? And continue
Mm,
this role that she's been given, where she is the captor, and Michiko is the captive. And ultimately, when Atsuko realizes that the state will throw her away as a black woman, right?
yeah.
She chooses, at the very least, up to where I've watched. I've only seen up to episode 11, so please,
Mm,
dude, if you watched it, be aware that that's where I'm seeing up to. She chooses to let Michiko go. And that's really interesting to me because is that how does that align with all these ideas that we talked about?
I think to me, the ways in which that aligns is, again, like, right, like if we're thinking about like there are aspects of those relationships, right? That that the captive maternal has with others, that again stabilizes like the state, right, and allows the state to enact more violence against not only the captain maternals but the people that the captain maternals care about. So and
Yes.
caregive for. So the thing here, right, is that, and that's why I like that conversation that they have when right, Michiko was kind of like, don't you want the chase to go on a little bit longer? Like, why are you going to catch me right
Mm, mm,
now?
mm, mm.
Right. And you can see, and the instances in which Atsuko lets Michiko go, or sort of like lets her escape, right? These are things that if we read into them on a sort of surface level, right? If we don't consider James's work, we would say, oh, well, Asuko is really kind and she's trying to help her friend. And we might just, against like the state, we might just end there. But again, if we consider James's work, and we consider again that the captain maternal and those relationships and that function, right, ultimately stabilizes the state, we can see Michiko and Atsuko's interaction, and that particular interaction, as stabilizing um, that uh, that dichotomy, right, of like um, cops and robbers, right, like in a very like kind of like basic sort of sense, right, like this is the chaser and the chased, right? The agent of the state and the fugitive of the state. Like
And
those
that
dichotomies are like
which is
solidified.
yeah, which brings us back to the Asada Shakur, right? One of her classic examples, right, of a Captain Maternal. Asada Shakur's image being used as this like fugitive who must be found reinforces this entire self-conception of America, right? And of the
Mm.
and of justice and of, you know, what how the state relates to political exiles effectively. Um, I think that just about wraps up what we can do for today. It did you have any last things you wanted to say, Danny, before we wrapped up?
Yeah, one last thing, because I don't want to forget about Pepe, right? So one thing I will say about her
Yes, Pepe.
character, that's kind of important to, again, relating back to this idea of the Captain Maternal and this idea of, like, you know, abolition and all this stuff, is that a question that a lot of individuals have, right, when we're thinking about the Captain Maternal and all of this, is what what is the end game for the captive maternal? And I think Pepe is really just this, like, um um there's like kind of like a pathetic sort of in a very sort of like pathetic way, right? And I don't mean like pathetic,
Mm.
I mean, like, you know, in the like the critical theoretical sense, is that the end game for often, right, is death, right? So the
Mm.
thing to kind of consider here, right, is like you have these characters, and Michiko, Atsuko, and Pepe all kind of work to kind of, in a really great way, showcase this like spectrum of the eventuality of you know, sort of the end, or the beginnings, the end, the middle, like grounds of the captive,
Mm.
like of the captive maternal, what happens. So I would leave off with that. I know it's a somber kind of place to end, but that's where I would leave it.
Yeah. Yeah, the captive maternal will be used for her labor and then thrown away.
Yep.
And that's what is so why there's an urgency, right? And a
Mm-hmm.
moral urgency, right, to understanding this, especially as we look at immigrant parents, as we look at all of these situations.
Of
All right.
course.
So, on that note, we are wrapping up. Uh, Danny, where can people find you?
You can always find me on Twitter at the Manga Scholar. And you can find me on YouTube. You can just type in the Black Manga Critic and you'll find like videos and my channel. And if you ever want to contact me about anything like related to what we've been discussing, or anything YouTube related, or Twitter related, you can send me an email at animemanga.ny@gmail.com.
Great. And if this has been Tony, you can find me at Poet Pedagogue on Twitter. And this has been Chatty AF, the Anime Feminist podcast. If you like what you heard, leave us a review and subscribe. Um, if you really like what you heard, you can follow us um, on Twitter at Anime Feminist, and you can subscribe to our Patreon. We are really trying to build up our Patreon so that we can pay our contributors and editors more, because people deserve good pay. And
Yes.
uh, we are. We also have a Ko-fi if you want to do a smaller donation. And with a Patreon subscription, you get access to our bonus podcasts and access to our Discord, which is such a fun place. Promise you'll love it there. One of the safest spaces for talking about anime and complex ideas that I've ever been in. All right, and with that, we are signing off. All right, bye, y'all.